Dove appears during fallen soldier funeral. The spiritual message that left everyone speechless. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds as if mourning alongside the people gathered at Arlington National Cemetery. A cold wind whispered through the rows of white headstones, carrying with it the hushed murmurs of grieving loved ones. The mourners stood in solemn silence, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Despite the vastness of the cemetery, the world seemed to shrink to this one sacred space, the place where Sergeant Daniel Carter would be laid to rest. Daniel had been more than just a soldier. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and to those who had fought beside him, he was a hero. His service had been marked by courage and selflessness, but his death had come too soon, leaving an ache that no words could soothe. His mother, Margaret Carter, stood near the casket, her hands clasped tightly together, as though willing herself to stay strong. She had received the news just 2 weeks ago. Her son had died while protecting his unit during an ambush. Even now, she struggled to accept it, to believe that the boy she had raised with so much love and hope was truly gone. Beside her stood Daniel's younger sister, Emily, her face pale and her eyes red from endless nights of crying. She held a folded piece of paper in her hands, his last letter to her, one she hadn't been able to bring herself to open. Not yet, not today. She had always looked up to her brother, always believed he was invincible. But now, standing in front of his flag-draped coffin, reality crashed over her like a wave, pulling her into the depths of sorrow. Rows of soldiers in uniform stood at attention, their faces expressionless, yet their eyes betraying the deep pain they felt. Among them was Lieutenant James Reynolds, Daniel's closest friend and the one who had been with him in his final moments. James had replayed that day in his mind 1,000 times, wondering if there was something, anything, he could have done differently. Survivor's guilt gnawed at him, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He had promised Daniel's mother that he would bring her son home, but now all he could offer was a folded flag and a handful of memories. A light drizzle began to fall, as if the heavens themselves were shedding tears. The soft patter of raindrops on the canopy above did little to muffle the quiet sobs of those in attendance. Old friends from Daniel's childhood, neighbors who had watched him grow up, and teachers who had once praised his boundless determination, all had come to say goodbye. Each person had a story to tell, a moment that painted Daniel not just as a soldier, but as a man full of life, laughter, and love. Margaret's mind drifted back to the last time she had seen him. It was the summer before his deployment, and they had spent the afternoon on the porch, drinking lemonade and talking about everything and nothing. He had been so full of dreams, so certain that he was meant to serve a greater purpose.
"Don't worry about me, Mom,"
he had said with a smile.
"No matter what happens, I'll always be with you."
She had brushed it off at the time, not realizing how much those words would come to mean. Now, standing here in the bitter chill of January, she clung to them like a lifeline. The ceremony began as the honor guard moved into position. The rhythmic march of boots against the wet ground echoed through the cemetery, a stark reminder of the discipline and duty Daniel had embodied. The soldiers held their rifles high, prepared for the final salute. The chaplain stepped forward, his voice steady but gentle.
"We are gathered here today to honor the life of Sergeant Daniel Carter, a brave soldier who gave everything in the service of his country. His courage, his sacrifice, and his unwavering commitment will never be forgotten."
The weight of loss pressed down on everyone. A single mother mourning her only son, a sister struggling to find meaning in his absence, a best friend carrying the burden of a promise unfulfilled, and a sea of people who had been touched by Daniel's presence, each of them grappling with the finality of death. As the chaplain continued, the rain ceased, and for a brief moment, a beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the coffin. It was as if the universe itself had paused, offering a fleeting moment of warmth in the midst of sorrow. The American flag draped the coffin, and the sound of soft weeping could be heard as the chaplain began the ceremony. Margaret Carter sat in the front row, her fingers tightly gripping a small, weathered envelope. It was the last letter her son, Sergeant Daniel Carter, had sent home before his final mission. The ink was slightly smudged from the tears she had shed while reading it over and over again. The words, written in his strong yet hurried handwriting, carried a bittersweet weight, a mixture of reassurance and unspoken farewell. As she clutched the letter, her mind drifted back to Daniel's childhood. Even as a boy, he had always dreamed of serving his country. While other children played with toy cars or action figures, Daniel had been fascinated by history books and stories of heroism. He would run through the backyard, an old camouflage jacket draped over his small frame, pretending to lead imaginary troops to victory.
Someday, I'm going to be a soldier, Mom.
He had said when he was just 10 years old. His eyes had sparkled with determination, the kind that never wavered, even as he grew older. Margaret had supported his dreams, even as they filled her with fear. When he enlisted right after high school, she had hugged him tightly, trying to memorize every detail of his face before he left for boot camp.
Be safe.
She had whispered. He had laughed, ruffling her hair the way he used to as a kid.
Always.
Daniel excelled in the military. His instructors praised his discipline, his leadership, and his unwavering sense of duty. He wasn't just another soldier. He was the kind of man others looked up to. His unit became his second family, and he treated them as such. Always the first to volunteer for dangerous assignments, always looking out for the younger recruits. But war changed people, and though Daniel remained strong, Margaret could sense the shift in him through his letters. The boy who once ran through the backyard pretending to be a hero had become a man who had seen the harshest realities of battle. In his final letter, he had written,
Mom, sometimes I wonder if we ever truly win in war. Out here, there are no victories, only survival. But I want you to know that despite everything, I've found peace in the chaos. I know my purpose, and I know that no matter what happens, I have no regrets. Please don't worry about me. Just know that I carry you, Emily, and all the love you've given me in my heart every day.
Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she recalled those words. He had found peace, but at what cost? She glanced at Emily, her daughter, who sat beside her, silent and pale. Emily had always adored her older brother. He had been her protector, her role model, the person who made her laugh when life felt unbearable. Losing him had shattered something inside her. She hadn't opened his last letter yet, too afraid of what it might say. Now, Margaret turned her gaze to the soldiers standing at attention, their eyes reflecting the same grief she felt. Among them was Lieutenant James Reynolds, Daniel's closest friend, and the last person to see him alive. James had known Daniel since their first deployment together. They had trained side by side, fought in the same battles, and shared countless late-night conversations about life, family, and the future. He had always admired Daniel, not just for his bravery, but for his heart. As the chaplain called on James to speak, the young lieutenant stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath before addressing the crowd.
I met Daniel Carter 6 years ago, and from the very beginning, he was the kind of man you wanted by your side. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a brother to all of us.
James paused, his jaw tightening as he fought back emotions.
I remember one mission in particular. We were caught in an ambush, pinned down with no way out. Enemy fire rained on us from all sides, and for a moment, I thought we wouldn't make it. But Daniel, he didn't hesitate. He ran straight into the line of fire to pull a wounded soldier to safety. He saved that man's life. But he didn't stop there. He stayed out in the open, drawing fire away from the rest of us so we could regroup. That was who he was, always putting others before himself.
The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of the sacrifice Daniel had made. James took a shaky breath before continuing.
I keep thinking back to something he once told me. He said, "If my time comes, I just want to know I did something that mattered."
James's voice broke slightly, but he steadied himself.
Daniel, if you're listening, you mattered. More than you'll ever know.
He stepped back, his hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders shaking slightly as he returned to his place among the soldiers. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. She had always known her son was special, but hearing these stories, seeing how deeply he had touched the lives of those around him, made her realize that his legacy would never fade. Her son had been more than a soldier. He had been a protector, a leader, a friend. And though he was gone, his spirit lived on in the hearts of those who had loved him. The funeral service pressed forward with the solemn precision of a military ritual. The chaplain's words faded into the cold January air, each sentence carrying the weight of grief and honor. Soldiers stood in stiff formation, their eyes fixed ahead, though many of them secretly stole glances at the flag-draped casket of Sergeant Daniel Carter. The rhythmic cadence of their breaths, slow and controlled, mirrored the discipline instilled in them through years of training. Then came the moment that everyone had been bracing for, the final military honors. The honor guard raised their rifles, the cold steel gleaming under the pale sunlight that had barely broken through the overcast sky. A commanding voice rang out.
Ready, aim, fire.
The first volley of shots cracked through the silence, the sharp report echoing across the cemetery. Several mourners flinched, their grief intensifying with each blast.
Ready, aim, fire.
Another round rang out, reverberating through the trees. Margaret Carter shut her eyes tightly, her fingers digging into the damp fabric of her black dress.
Ready, aim, fire.
The final volley. A collective breath seemed to be drawn in by the mourners as the last echoes faded into the wind. Then from a short distance away came the slow, mournful notes of a lone bugle playing taps. The first few notes hung in the air, fragile and haunting, sending fresh tears down the faces of Daniel's loved ones. The melody wove through the crowd, a final farewell to a fallen soldier. As the last note lingered in the crisp air, something unexpected happened. A white dove appeared in the sky. At first it was barely noticeable against the gray clouds, a single figure gliding through the heavens. But as it drew closer, the mourners began to take notice. A quiet murmur spread through the gathering as heads tilted upward, eyes widening in disbelief. The dove flew with effortless grace, circling the ceremony in slow, deliberate arcs. It was no ordinary bird. There was something almost ethereal about it, as if it had emerged from another realm just for this moment. Margaret gasped, clutching Emily's hand. Her daughter's fingers were trembling, her lips slightly parted as she watched the dove move above them. Even the soldiers, trained to stand emotionless in formation, shifted subtly, unable to ignore the unexplainable presence of the bird. Lieutenant James Reynolds, standing rigid with his fellow servicemen, felt a strange sensation creep up his spine. He had seen many things in war, many moments that defied logic, but this was different. The dove made one final pass above the mourners before descending. With a soft flutter of its wings, it landed gracefully atop Daniel's casket. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The bird did not startle, nor did it seem afraid of the dozens of eyes fixated upon it. Instead, it stood still, its tiny body rising and falling with gentle breaths, its feathers pristine against the dark blue of the American flag draped over the casket. Margaret brought a trembling hand to her lips, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her mind raced back to a conversation she had with Daniel long ago.
If I don't make it back, I'll find a way to let you know I'm okay.
She had dismissed it at the time, brushing it off as the kind of thing soldiers said before deployments. But now, watching the dove settle onto her son's resting place, a powerful certainty gripped her heart. This was him. This was Daniel's way of telling them he was at peace. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks, her hand gripping the unopened letter in her pocket. Her brother's words, still unread, suddenly felt heavier than ever. She took an unsteady step forward, but stopped short, unwilling to disturb the stillness of the moment. James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had never been one to believe in signs or miracles. But as he stared at the dove, a wave of emotion crashed over him. Daniel had always spoken of freedom, of wanting to fly beyond the limits of the battlefield. And now, in the midst of their sorrow, here was a symbol of that very thing, a creature of peace, appearing at the very moment they needed it most. The cemetery was utterly silent. Even the wind had died down, as if nature itself had paused in reverence. The weight of the moment pressed upon them, overwhelming in its quiet power. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire gathering fell into stunned silence, overwhelmed by the symbolism of the moment. A hush fell over the cemetery, the kind of silence that carried more weight than words ever could. Every eye remained locked on the white dove perched atop Daniel Carter's flag-draped coffin. The small bird, so delicate yet unwavering, sat there as if it had been sent with a purpose. No one dared to move. as if the slightest motion would break the fragile magic of the moment. Margaret Carter was the first to react. A sharp breath escaped her lips, and then, like a dam breaking, the tears came in uncontrollable waves. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand, her body shaking from the depth of her grief and astonishment.
I'll find a way to let you know that I'm at peace, knowing I served my country with honor.
The words echoed in her mind, a memory so vivid that she could almost hear Daniel's voice whispering them again. She had dismissed it at the time, laughing softly at her son's earnestness, unwilling to entertain the possibility of losing him. But now here she stood, the cold wind biting at her skin, staring at a dove that had arrived at the very moment of his final farewell. She took a step closer to the coffin, her sobs quiet but raw.
Daniel.
She whispered, almost afraid to say his name too loudly, as if she might break whatever force had brought the bird here.
You kept your promise.
Emily, standing beside her mother, clutched Daniel's unopened letter in her hand. She hadn't found the courage to read his last words yet, but as she stared at the dove, she knew she would have to. Maybe the letter held more than just goodbyes. Maybe, just maybe, it would help her understand why this was happening. Lieutenant James Reynolds had spent years in battle, witnessing things that had hardened him, made him skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained. But this was different. His mind reeled back to a conversation he'd had with Daniel months before their final mission together. They had been sitting around a small fire at base camp, the night sky stretching endlessly above them. Daniel had been uncharacteristically reflective, staring into the flames as if lost in thought.
You ever think about what happens after this?
Daniel had asked, tossing a small rock into the fire. James had smirked, shaking his head.
After what? The mission?
No.
Daniel had said softly.
After everything. After we're gone.
James had shrugged.
I don't know. Haven't thought much about it.
Daniel had looked up at the sky then, his expression unreadable.
My mom always told me doves were signs of peace, hope, freedom. If I ever go, I'd like to think I'd come back as one, just to let people know I'm okay.
James had laughed at the time, shaking his head.
That's a little poetic for a guy who spends most of his time dodging bullets.
Daniel had just smiled.
Yeah, maybe.
Now as James stood in the freezing air, staring at the white dove resting atop his best friend's casket, the memory hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt his knees weaken slightly, his breath catching in his throat. It was too perfect, too precise. He hadn't believed in signs before. But this? James swallowed hard and whispered under his breath.
You made it back, Danny.
The crowd stirred, murmurs spreading like ripples on water. Some mourners clung to their faith, whispering about divine intervention, a heavenly sign sent to ease their pain. Others, more skeptical, exchanged bewildered glances, shaken by the eerie timing but hesitant to attribute it to anything beyond coincidence. An elderly man, a veteran who had seen his fair share of loss, removed his cap and nodded in silent reverence. A woman clutched a rosary to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she whispered a quiet prayer. Even those who had never considered the possibility of life beyond death felt something stir deep within them, an inexplicable feeling of connection, of presence. A young boy no older than 10 tugged on his father's sleeve and pointed at the dove.
Dad, is that the soldier?
He asked in a hushed voice. His father hesitated, glancing at the bird before kneeling down to meet his son's gaze.
Maybe, buddy.
He said gently.
Maybe it is.
The wind had stilled, the cemetery holding its breath. For a moment it felt as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the life that had been lost and the message that had been sent in return. Some guests believed it was a divine sign, a final reassurance that Daniel Carter's soul had found peace. Others were left simply speechless, unable to explain the event, but unable to deny the profound weight of the moment. The funeral had ended, but the weight of loss still hung heavily in the air. The guests had slowly begun to disperse, offering whispered condolences and solemn nods before making their way to their cars. The honor guard had folded the American flag with practiced precision and presented it to Margaret Carter, who clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. Emily Carter, Daniel's younger sister, had barely spoken throughout the service. She had stood beside her mother, dry-eyed and silent, feeling like she was watching everything from a distance, as if none of it were real, but the dove that had shaken her. Even now, as she sat in her childhood bedroom, staring at the unopened letter in her hands, she could still see it, the way it had circled above the mourners, the way it had landed so delicately on Daniel's casket, unmoving and fearless. It had been surreal, almost too perfect to be coincidence. Emily traced her fingers over the envelope. She had found it tucked inside her purse after the funeral, a letter Daniel had written before his final mission. She had been too afraid to open it before, too terrified of the finality of his words. But now, with the image of the white dove burned into her memory, she felt she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the letter and began to read.
Dear M, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. And if that's the case, I need you to do something for me. I know you. I know you're probably shutting yourself off from the world right now, trying to pretend you're fine when you're not. But don't do that, M. Don't let my death steal your life. I want you to live. I don't mean just exist. I mean really live. Laugh too hard. Love too much. Chase every crazy dream you've ever had. Don't waste time being afraid. If I've learned anything over here, it's that life is too damn short to spend it hesitating. Now, this is going to sound weird, but I need you to hear me out. A few weeks ago, I had this dream. It was so real that I woke up with my heart pounding. In the dream, I was gone, but I wasn't afraid. I was at peace. And there was this white dove flying over my grave. It wasn't just any dove. It was me. My spirit. I knew somehow that I was free, that I was where I was supposed to be. And I remember thinking, they see this. I hope they understand. If you ever see a dove after I'm gone, I want you to know. It's me. Not in a ghostly way, not in some creepy, haunting way. Just in the way that matters, in the way that says, I'm okay. You'll be okay too. So when you see it, don't cry. Don't grieve for me. Just smile, because I got to do what I loved. I got to protect the people I cared about. And I got to have a sister like you, which is probably the greatest gift I ever had. I love you, Em. Always. Daniel.
Emily's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she could even think, let alone speak. A dove. Her brother had seen it before it even happened. Tears spilled onto the paper as she clutched it to her chest, her body racked with silent sobs. She had held on to so much anger, so much grief, refusing to accept the finality of his death. But now, for the first time since she had heard the news, something inside her shifted. Daniel had known. Somehow, in ways she would never understand, he had known. She rushed downstairs, still gripping the letter, her breath coming in uneven gasps. Margaret was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of untouched tea. When she saw Emily's face, she immediately stood up.
Em, what is it?
Emily couldn't speak. Instead, she simply handed the letter to her mother, watching as Margaret's eyes moved across the words. She saw the moment realization dawned on her, the way her breath caught, the way her shoulders trembled. When she finished reading, Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, closing her eyes as fresh tears slipped down her cheeks.
Oh, Daniel,
She whispered.
you really did keep your promise.
The letter made its way through the family, each person reacting in their own way. Some wept openly. Some simply sat in stunned silence, as if struggling to process what they had just read. James Reynolds was the last to read it. When he finished, he let out a slow breath, shaking his head in quiet disbelief.
He told me once.
He murmured, mostly to himself.
He told me he'd come back as a dove.
Margaret exhaled shakily, nodding.
And he did.
No one could explain it. No one could understand how Daniel had foreseen something so specific, so profound. But they all felt it. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't chance. It was Daniel's final farewell. The days following the funeral were filled with a strange stillness, as if time itself had paused in quiet reflection. The house felt emptier without Daniel's presence, but something had shifted within Margaret Carter. The crushing weight of grief that had threatened to consume her had softened into something different. Not quite acceptance, not yet closure, but a quiet understanding. She sat on the porch one morning, wrapped in Daniel's old army jacket, staring at the sky. It was early, and the world was still waking up. The crisp air carried the scent of wet grass, and a soft breeze rustled the trees in the distance. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, a white dove fluttered down onto the wooden railing. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the same dove from the funeral. She knew that logically, but something deep inside told her it didn't matter. A tear slipped down her cheek, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from sorrow.
Hi, sweetheart.
She whispered, a small, trembling smile forming on her lips. The bird tilted its head slightly, watching her in silence. She let out a soft, shaky laugh.
You always did have a way of making me feel better.
The dove remained for a few moments longer before spreading its wings and taking flight. Margaret watched it disappear into the sky, feeling an overwhelming sense of warmth in her chest. Daniel was at peace. She could feel it now, in a way she hadn't before. The pain of losing him would never fully fade, but she understood now that he wasn't truly gone. He was here, in the memories they carried, in the love they still held for him, and somehow, impossibly, miraculously, in that dove. Margaret closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. For the first time since she had received the devastating news, she felt as though she could breathe again. James Reynolds had always carried a heavy burden, but losing Daniel had been the hardest weight of all. Survivor's guilt was something every soldier knew, but knowing that Daniel had died while saving others had made it even harder to bear. He had spent the days after the funeral unable to shake the feeling that he should have done more, should have been the one in Daniel's place. But the dove had changed something in him, and the letter, Daniel's letter, had changed everything. He sat alone at a small park near the military base, staring down at the worn piece of paper in his hands. He had read it so many times now that he could recite it from memory.
If you ever see a dove after I'm gone, I want you to know it's me. I'm okay. You'll be okay too.
James exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Daniel had always been the optimistic one, the guy who could find hope in the darkest of places. James had spent so much time mourning his death that he hadn't stopped to consider what Daniel would have wanted for him. The pain of loss would never go away completely. James knew that, but maybe, just maybe, he could start living in a way that honored Daniel's sacrifice instead of being weighed down by it. For the first time in a long time, he thought about the future, about all the things he had put off, all the dreams he had pushed aside. He thought about the family he had neglected to visit, the promises he had made to himself before the war had hardened him. He thought about living. James folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time since Daniel's death, he was willing to find out. The story of the dove spread quickly through the town. It started with those who had attended the funeral, close friends and family who had witnessed the moment firsthand. But then, as people shared what had happened, the story took on a life of its own. Neighbors, co-workers, even strangers began speaking of it as a sign, a reminder that love never truly fades, that those we lose are never really gone. Margaret received letters from people she had never met, veterans, grieving parents, young soldiers preparing for deployment, all sharing their own experiences, their own signs of hope. A local newspaper picked up the story, publishing an article about Daniel's letter and the dove that had appeared at his funeral. Soon it spread beyond the small town, reaching people who had never known Daniel Carter, but who found comfort in his story. Churches shared it in sermons. Teachers spoke of it in classrooms. People who had lost loved ones began looking for their own signs, their own symbols of peace. One evening, as Margaret sat in her living room, a letter arrived from a woman across the country.
My son was a soldier, too. I lost him years ago, and I've carried that grief with me every day. But your story, your son's story, gave me something I haven't felt in a long time. Hope. Thank you.
Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her face. Daniel's life had meant something. His sacrifice had mattered. And in a way she never could have imagined, he was still making a difference. Margaret looked out the window toward the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, twinkling softly against the deep blue canvas of night. She closed her eyes and smiled. Somewhere out there, Daniel was at peace. And now so was she. Weeks had passed since the funeral, yet the ache of loss still lingered like a shadow. The world had continued moving, but for those who loved Daniel Carter, time seemed to have slowed. His absence was felt in every empty chair at the dinner table, in the silence where his laughter should have been, in the way his mother's eyes always seemed to carry a quiet sorrow. For Emily Carter, life without her older brother felt like walking through a fog, disconnected, uncertain, and forever searching for something just out of reach. She had spent nights rereading his last letter, memorizing every word, trying to hold on to the warmth of his presence. The dove at the funeral had given her hope, had given all of them a sense of peace. But there were still moments when she felt lost, drifting between grief and acceptance. Then Daniel's birthday arrived. Emily had known from the moment she woke up that she couldn't let the day pass without visiting him. The cemetery was quiet when she arrived, the mid-morning sun casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby oak tree, filling the air with the soft whisper of nature's breath. Emily clutched a bouquet of white lilies, Daniel's favorite flower, as she walked toward his grave. She had spent years teasing him about it, how a tough soldier could have such a soft favorite flower. But he had only ever shrugged, saying,
They remind me of fresh starts.
Now more than ever, she understood. She knelt down, carefully placing the lilies against the cool stone. Her fingers traced the engraved letters of his name, Sergeant Daniel Carter. Beloved son, brother, and friend, a hero forever in our hearts. Emily exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to the headstone as she whispered,
Happy birthday, Danny.
The weight of everything, the love, the loss, the memories, settled deep in her chest. She had so much she wanted to say, so many things she wished she had told him when she had the chance.
I miss you.
She murmured.
So much.
The wind picked up slightly, ruffling her hair. She wiped at her tears, swallowing hard.
Mom's doing okay. Better than I thought she would be. She still cries, but she smiles more now, too. James is healing, I think. He talks about you a lot. And me.
She let out a soft, shaky laugh.
I'm trying, Danny. I really am.
She closed her eyes, tilting her face toward the sky.
I just wish you were here.
And then, as if in answer, a flutter of wings broke the silence. Emily's breath caught as she turned, her heart hammering in her chest. A white dove had appeared, perching delicately on the top of Daniel's headstone. For a moment, all she could do was stare. It was just like before, the same pure, gentle presence, the same quiet grace. The dove didn't seem afraid, didn't seem in a hurry to leave. It simply sat there, watching her, as if waiting for her to understand. Emily felt something shift inside her. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't random. It was him. A choked laugh escaped her lips, and she wiped at her face, tears falling freely now.
Hey, Danny.
She whispered. The dove remained still, as if listening. Emily smiled through her tears.
Thank you.
The bird tilted its head slightly before spreading its wings. In a single, effortless motion, it lifted off the headstone and soared into the sky, disappearing into the brilliant blue expanse above. Emily watched it go, standing there long after it had vanished from sight. But this time, she didn't feel the ache of loss as sharply. Instead, she felt something else. Peace. She knelt once more, pressing a final kiss to her fingers before touching them to the headstone.
I'll be okay, she promised softly. I think I finally understand now.
And for the first time since losing him, she truly believed it. Stories have a way of taking on a life of their own. What began as a quiet moment of grief and wonder at Sergeant Daniel Carter's funeral soon became something greater. Word of the dove's mysterious appearance spread beyond the family. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers found comfort in the tale, seeing it as a reminder that love transcends death. Margaret Carter received letters from people she had never met, grieving parents, veterans, and those searching for hope. Each one thanked her for sharing Daniel's story, for reminding them that their loved ones might still be near in ways they couldn't see. Emily Carter carried the story forward, telling it to anyone who needed reassurance that goodbye wasn't the end. The moment at Daniel's grave, the dove's gentle presence had changed something deep inside her. She no longer felt lost in grief. Instead, she found peace in knowing her brother had found his own. James Reynolds, once consumed by guilt, also found healing. He reconnected with the families of fallen soldiers, sharing Daniel's story and offering support to those struggling with loss. Each time he spoke of Daniel, he made sure to include the dove, a symbol of peace, a final message from a friend gone too soon. As the months passed, Daniel's story never faded. It became the kind of tale people shared in quiet moments, in times of sorrow and in times of hope. The message remained clear. Love endures, and the Spirit finds a way to bring peace to those left behind. One evening, Margaret returned to the cemetery. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the headstones. She traced Daniel's name with her fingers, not with sorrow, but with love. And then, just as she turned to leave, a white dove soared across the sky. Margaret smiled softly.
Thank you, sweetheart.
With her heart full of gratitude, she walked home, carrying his love with her forever.